We're breaking down all of the Falcons' initial cuts to 53, and I promise you, I'm not going to go on a rant that roster cornerstone Parker Hesse is among them.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, welcome back to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta. And today's illustrious episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, who are going to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, your very humble host here of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast. You may know me from my coverage of the Atlanta Falcons for many years, going back decades over at falconfans.com, RIP. You may also know me as my aliases. Sirius Black is one, Mr. Drew is the other. They call me Mr. Drew, all right? But my friends call me Negative Nancy, but you can call me Mr. Drew. And if you want to become my friend so that you can call me Negative Nancy, then you just have to be an everydayer. That makes this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so that you can get the latest episode as soon as it's available. So today we're talking all about the Falcons, quote unquote, final cuts, or should we say more accurately, initial cuts to get to the 53-man roster, because there will probably be more moves made, and we'll talk about that in a second. But later in today's episode, we'll talk about the decision to release roster cornerstone Parker Hesse. If anybody, all the everydayers know that I'm not a fan of that decision, and I'm sure you're patiently waiting to hear what I have to say about that and the choice words I have for Terry Fontenot and company for that decision. But we'll see how that goes. And then, of course, we'll break down all the cuts, and we'll sort of catch you up on some of the other cuts, particularly on the offensive line on today's episode. So starting off talking the conversation about sort of, if you go back to yesterday's episode where I made my 53-man roster projection, 5 players that I projected to not make the Falcons roster did wind up make it. Those players were quarterback Logan Woodside, offensive lineman Javon Gwynn, tight end John Fitzpatrick, defensive lineman Joe Gaziano, and defensive lineman Albert Huggins. And basically, if you didn't include the wide receiver position, because I've made statements many times that like the wide receiver 5 spot was a complete toss-up, but if you had asked me sort of the 5 of the players that I did not put on that projection on yesterday's episode, who were probably the top 5 guys that were the closest to being on there, I probably would have named those 5 guys. Now, I probably would have put like Natron Brooks over Javon Gwynn, but like if you had asked me the top 6 or 7 guys, I probably would have had those 5 guys among the top 6 or 7 guys to be more accurate. But, when you do the math on the Falcons roster, at least their initial roster makeup, and we'll see what moves come in the next couple of days, they're currently keeping 3 quarterbacks, 4 running backs, including the fullback Keith Smith, 5 receivers, 4 tight ends, 9 offensive linemen. That's a pretty conventional offensive breakdown of the roster with 25 players on the offense. They're on defense. They're keeping 11 defensive linemen / edge rushers, whatever you want to call front players, 4 linebackers, 6 corners, and 4 safeties. So outside of maybe adding 1 more defensive lineman versus a extra linebacker, right? That's a pretty conventional sort of breakdown of the Falcons roster. And we'll see if the team makes additional moves over the next week or so leading up to week 1. You can look at that initial roster and look at, okay, they didn't keep a 4th running back or a 5th running back, but not counting the fullback, a 4th halfback, I guess you could say. And that's a promising sign that Cordero Patterson's on track to be ready week 1. You can also make the case. So my initial roster projection had them keeping 7 corners. So that's a promising sign that Mike Hughes is on track for week 1. We'll see about Jeff Okudah. I still remain skeptical that Jeff Okudah might play week 1. I remain highly skeptical that Jeff Okudah is going to play week 1. I feel like if that was an option, Arthur Smith probably would have said something at some point in the last week or so of that being a possibility, but we'll see how that goes. So, there's likely to be other moves made over the next 10 days before we get to week 1. right? Last year, if you just go off of what they did last year between the initial cuts and week one, you saw them pick up a couple of guys off the waiver wires like Matt Dickerson and Chuma Adoga. They cut Mike Ford and Dean Marlowe to make room for those guys. Then you saw them put several guys on injured reserve like Deion Jones and Marlon Davidson, Isaiah Oliver, Jalen Mayfield, John Fitzpatrick, and then brought back guys like Ford and Marlowe. They brought back guys like Abdullah Anderson, who was initially cut, Colby Gossett, who was initially cut, Nick Kwiatkowski, who was initially cut. So I'm not expecting the Falcons to stand pat with their current 53 headed into week one. Given our questions on the offensive line, in terms of the depth there, my expectation is we'll see them make a move there. I've seen other people express concerns about the wide receiver position, linebacker position. I'm sure some of you guys also have concerns at other positions that you would like to see this team potentially upgrade as well. So we'll see what moves the Falcons wind up making, and that will be all, the topic of conversation on tomorrow's episode, where those waiver claims could be made. But that leads me to what I want to talk about next, which is Parker Hesse. And the only thing that's keeping me from going on a massive rant, like I'm going to say some things on today's episode, but like the only thing that's keeping me from basically going, this is the worst move the Falcons have ever made in the history of the world. I'm in my emotions, guys, right? Is basically the knowledge that more moves are coming. And so the possibility that Parker Hesse is not done here in Atlanta, that roster cornerstone that we know Parker Hesse to be is not done here in Atlanta. That's the only thing that's keeping me from making an epic rant on today's episode. So we'll see how that rant goes as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, we know that the Falcons' success this year depends on having the right team members on their football team to reach their goals. And you can question if they have the right team without Parker Hesse, but you don't have to worry about that, right? You don't have to worry about losing out on the next Parker Hesse, that cornerstone for your small business or whatever you're hiring for, because you have LinkedIn Jobs, right? That's where you can go to quickly attract and hire the qualified candidates by matching with the right people that have the right skills, values, and experiences that are going to help you achieve your goals. You can put your free job posts in minutes in front of over 800 million profiles, and you can find the most qualified candidates with LinkedIn Jobs. It's easy to screen and rate applicants based on your job qualifications, all on one platform. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn number one in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs is going to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So the Falcons cut roster cornerstone Parker Hesse. And so, all plans and strategies of positionless football have just completely gone out the window as far as I'm concerned, because to me, Parker Hesse was a key component of that. Now, making the roster as that fourth tight end instead of Parker Hesse was John Fitzpatrick. And I'm sure many of you guys are sitting here going, I thought John Fitzpatrick looked good this preseason. Why not keep John Fitzpatrick over Parker Hesse, right? He made a couple of nice catches, and you're absolutely right. He did make a couple of nice catches. The question I asked, did he make a couple of nice blocks, though? And you're probably sitting there going, well, why does that matter? Who cares about blocks? Well, you care about blocks because, and Arthur Smith certainly cares about blocks because, Mac Hollins is his number two, right? So, but, in a world where Mac Hollins is your number two, you have Kyle Pitts, you have Jonnu Smith, you have Drake London, you have Bijan Robinson, Cordero Patterson, and whoever else you want to throw into that list of players. How many passes do you think the Falcons are going to throw to, this incredible pass catching tight end that is none other than John Fitzpatrick, right? You look at Parker Hesse, he had 11 targets last year. You look the previous year, Lee Smith in basically the same role had 11 targets that year. And so basically the argument I'm basically making is whether it's Hesse or Lee Smith or now John Fitzpatrick, if any of those guys or the ball is going to any of those guys, it means something has horribly gone wrong on the football play, right? Like that is not the plan. They're not scheming up ways to feature Hesse and Smith and Fitzpatrick is basically what I'm sitting here saying. And it's interesting because like earlier this week, Arthur Smith was talking after one of the practices over the weekend or whenever it was. And he said, I can't remember the exact question and the exact nature of the answer he said, but someone was basically asking him, how much does what players did for the team last year contribute to their ability to make the roster this year? And basically he said something along the lines of like, I don't really care what you did last year. It's about what you can do now. And in my mind, a part of me was like, is he talking about Parker Hesse? And I was like, no, there's no way he's talking about Parker Hesse, because if there's no way he would use that as a way to talk about Parker Hesse because we got Michael Pruitt on there. Michael Pruitt wasn't with the team in the offseason. Michael Pruitt's basically played no snaps in the preseason outside of one drive against the Bengals. Did nothing on that drive, really. And so he's basically riding high off of what he did last year. So if, that's a shot at Parker Hesse, then clearly, that's also a shot at Michael Pruitt, right? But, so that was like for the last couple of weeks, I've been sitting here going like in my mind, like why is Parker Hesse playing in the fourth quarter? Oh, well, it's because he's young and he's such a team player, right? That you can put Parker Hesse out there in quote unquote garbage time in a preseason game with the third stringers. That would be disrespectful to Michael Pruitt, but Parker Hesse is such a team guy that he's willing to do that and play all the special team snaps and play, 40, 50 snaps a game. Michael Pruitt being 31 plus, he's not ready to go out there and lay it on the line for 40 plus snaps in a preseason game. And so part of me was sitting here these last couple of weeks. I mean, of course, Parker Hesse, I shouldn't read anything into Parker Hesse being, deep on the depth chart. Right. And of course, like now we're here and I should have been listening to the voice in the back of my head. Right. And so, we joke about Parker Hesse being this roster cornerstone, but even though it's a joke, it's kind of true, right? Because the Falcons offense doesn't really function without Parker Hesse's blocking ability, right? The fact that he was a significantly better lead blocker than Keith Smith was last year, the fact that he was even a better blocker than Lee Smith was the previous year, and Lee Smith spent an entire decade in the NFL solely because of his blocking ability, I just think speaks to the essential nature that Parker Hesse is for this Falcons roster. So I'm assuming, again, have to give the Falcons the benefit of the doubt, can't panic here, right? And assume the Falcons aren't brain dead, right? I'm in my emotions, guys. Just let me go through it, right? Just let me get this out. And they're going to bring him back, right? Last year they cut Anthony Ferkser initially and then only brought him back like the day before week one. They put him on the practice squad and then brought him back up to the roster. And I remember thinking at that time, like, they're definitely bringing Anthony Ferkser back to the roster, right? Like, what is this thing? So I'm hoping it's a situation like that, even though like I feel like, that's disrespectful to Parker Hesse. But, that's just me. And the issue I think I'm going to have is the fact that Parker Hesse is subject to waivers, right? Because he only has 3 years of NFL experience. And right, you need 4 not to be subject to waivers. And so now the Falcons are at the mercy of the waiver claim that some team could come and scoop up Parker Hesse. And even if the Falcons did intend to bring him back, they don't really control that anymore. And for those of you that are not familiar with what waivers is, basically, if you cut a player with 3 or less years of NFL experience, he is subject to waivers, right? Which means that the other 31 teams can claim him within 24 hours of his release, right? And if multiple teams put a claim on a player, the team that gets him is based off of priority, which at this point in the calendar is based off of the most recent draft order, right? So, I guess Chicago would have, I think the way it works is Chicago would have top priority on the waiver claims, not Carolina. So, later in the year, once I can't remember how many games need to be played, but I think when it's like week 4 or week 6 or week 8, sometime around there, sometime in October, basically, I think it switches to the current records is what determines waiver priority. So basically we're at the mercy of the waiver system, and any team that basically wants to take a swing on one of the best blocking tight ends in the NFL can have Parker Hesse, assuming that they have, priority in the waivers. And so, now we're sitting here, hey, you got 31-year-old Keith Smith that's on the decline. Keith Smith liked one of my tweets today where I was slandering him. So he's out there in these Twitter streets, using salacious tweets as motivation. So hopefully this motivates Keith Smith to look much better than he did last year, where he was just a guy. And of course, we still have 31-year-old Michael Pruitt. So, he is a unicorn. So I'll give Michael Pruitt that, right? But it does feel like to me at his age, the glitter is starting to flake off of that unicorn, if you get my drift. So we'll see how that goes, but we'll wrap up today breaking down all the cuts. We'll talk about the Falcons bringing in cornerback Malcolm Butler. Yes, that Malcolm Butler in for a trial. And we'll talk about some of the offensive linemen that got cut today that the Falcons can maybe kick the tires on as well. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons, guys, I want to once again give a shout out to the everydayers that continue to make this podcast their first listen. Um, and look forward to that first listen whenever if we wake up tomorrow and Parker Hesse's been claimed by, I don't know, the Bears or the Cardinals or whoever. That's going to be a fun first listen for you guys. But of course, tomorrow we'll be talking, presumably, in addition to that, about the Falcons waiver claims and any additional moves and additions that they make. Also, we should get word that the practice squad will, at least the initial practice squad, up to 16 players, will get established. I think the last couple of years, the Falcons haven't always filled all 16 spots on day one. But they'll usually get to like at least a dozen spots. So we'll see how that goes. But that will probably be what we'll talk about as your first listen on tomorrow's episode. But wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, if you didn't hear, Malcolm Butler is being worked out by the Atlanta Falcons. Yes, former Patriots and Titans cornerback Malcolm Butler. And yeah, he hasn't played since, at least in the regular season, since 2020. So it's been almost 3 years. He did sign with the Arizona Cardinals. The 2020 was last with the Titans. He signed with the Arizona Cardinals the following offseason in 2021, then retired at the end of training camp, basically was done with football. I guess that's playing for Cliff Kingsbury for you. Then decided after the 2021 season to come out of retirement, re-signed with the New England Patriots, then got hurt in camp, went on IR, they cut him. And then the last thing that I've seen and heard about Malcolm Butler was in last October, where he got a workout with the Dolphins. And, basically for the last 10 months, no one has heard anything about Malcolm Butler. So it does make me wonder what this means. Are the Falcons just kind of kicking their tires on him? As Smith would say, we leave no stone unturned to see sort of what Malcolm Butler has in the tank to improve this roster. Or is this legit serious interest? And what does that mean? Does that tell us something about the status of the cornerbacks heading into week one, with Mike Hughes and Jeff Okudah dealing with their injuries? Mike Hughes dealing with a soft tissue injury, Jeff Okudah dealing with an undisclosed ankle issue from earlier in training camp that we're speculating is a high ankle sprain. So I don't know, right? My assumption is the Falcons are just kicking his tires, right? This coaching staff is familiar with Butler from his time in Tennessee, where he played under Dean Pease. He played under Arthur Smith or not under Arthur Smith, but on the Titans when Arthur Smith was the OC there. And so it feels like this is more of them doing a solid, like maybe Malcolm Butler reaching out to them and like, hey, I want to play football. Can I come and work out with you? Rather than the Falcons deciding, you know what, we need cornerback help. Let's call Malcolm Butler, right? Because if that's your plan B at cornerback in the event that there is a pressing concern at that position, I don't think Malcolm Butler would be your plan B. He feels like he'd be more like plan G or something like that. Like we would have heard about the Falcons bringing other players, over the last several weeks to try out at the cornerback position. As far as I'm aware, and again, not all the tryouts and workouts get publicized, but as far as I'm aware, like they haven't really brought in anybody in the last couple of weeks. So I'm assuming that this isn't necessarily, the Falcons are, 100% planning on signing Malcolm Butler, but we'll just sort of have to see if something comes of that. But let's break down these cuts, go lightning round with the position by position, starting with the quarterbacks. The Falcons are keeping 3 quarterbacks in with Logan Woodside surviving the initial cuts. We'll see if, he makes it till week one, and the Falcons do intend to carry 3 quarterbacks into week one and beyond. Again, my guess is like I don't see the point of carrying 3 quarterbacks at this point in time, but I think Logan, as I've said many times on this podcast, Logan Woodside has played well enough to make the roster, but I just don't see the value given some of the other injuries. But maybe this again is a luxury signing, or a sign of luxury that the Falcons are going to be a lot healthier going into week one than we thought. But basically, my take was like, that's a luxury player to keep, and you need bodies at other positions. So we'll see how that goes. But moving on to the running back position, Carlos Washington and Godwin Igwebuike were cut. Washington was not a surprise, but Igwebuike wasn't a surprise, but thought he had done enough to make the roster. But again, thought he was more of an insurance policy for Patterson's questionable injury status. And again, maybe this is a sign that Patterson is good to go. I could see Igwebuike getting claimed off of waivers given how well he played this summer. And if that's not the case, I would assume he's a front runner to be one of the practice squad players. Fullback Clint Ratkovich did get the boot. Saw tweet earlier today about him being one of the highest graded fullbacks according to PFF this summer. And I was like, that's weird. I did remember seeing a high grade from him in one of these preseason games. And then I double checked and I'm like, okay, yeah, he was. And I'm like, I don't recall him actually hitting a block this entire summer. So yeah, I must have missed that. But apparently I might be putting too much stock in blocking ability, which, given a team that's going to run the ball 550 times this year, I don't understand why I'm on an island with that. But hey, that's a conversation for a different day. Let's talk wide receivers. JJ Arcega, Whiteside, Matthew Sexton, Zay Malone, Keelan Harris, and Slade Bolden were cut. Penny Hart is going on injured reserve. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, because he went on injured reserve today and not tomorrow, Penny Hart is done for the year with that concussion. So I'm assuming that the Falcons are going to probably do what they did last year with a couple of guys that they put on IR on the initial cut day and then cut those guys like a week from now. Reach an injury settlement with those guys. So we'll see how that goes. So this means Josh Ali did stick as that fifth receiver. It seemed like that was the direction that we were leaning towards, but we'll see if that lasts, if the Falcons bring in another wide receiver. My guess is that, as I've said before, if they do bring in a wide receiver, I think it will be more of a special teams guy than someone that's expected to contribute on offense. The tight end position, Tucker Fisk and Parker Hesse got cut. If we lose on Parker Hesse, I guess if we can keep Tucker Fisk on the practice squad, because he does have some Parker Hesse-like skills in terms of being able to line up at multiple spots, but that doesn't feel like a good consolation prize for me personally at that spot, but we'll see. Offensive line, Tyler Vrabel, Jonathan Harrison, Michael Manet, Justin Schaefer, Barry Wesley, and Trevor Reed were all cut. We'll see who among these guys are brought back on the practice squad, but you can count Justin Schaefer as another quote unquote miss for the Falcons in terms of their offensive line drafting. We'll see what Matthew Bergeron is. Hopefully we'll see Drew Dahlman continue to develop and grow. But Schaefer and Mayfield, haven't been great, and we'll see what happens with Javon Gwynn as well. So it's been 50-50 really at this point in time. So we didn't see major growth from Schaefer this summer. And so, I don't expect the Falcons to bring him back on the practice squad, but we'll see. Defensive line, Timmy Horn, LaCale London, Kavion Patton were all cut. Horn is a mild surprise, but as I said yesterday, even though he played really well against the Dolphins, was pretty quiet against the Bengals in Pittsburgh, and that might have been enough for somebody else to come and leapfrog him, and presumably that was Albert Huggins, who also played really well against the Dolphins and then was kind of quiet against the Bengals and Steelers as well. But as I told Jarvis on the show a week ago, the Falcons had a good enough depth at this D-line group that they were going to wind up cutting somebody that is probably going to go elsewhere and stick in the league. And we'll see that player potentially, playing 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And, that may be Timmy Horn at this point in time. As far as edge rushers goes, Kamoko Toure and Damone Harris were cut. That does mean that Joe Gaziano did make the roster. As I said earlier, that's not a surprise. He played well in the 2 preseason games that he did play. As I said on yesterday's episode, to me, he looks much more game ready to play meaningful snaps week 1 than Zach Harrison did. And now with the Falcons having 11 D linemen currently on the roster, there's a good chance that 2 of these guys are going to be inactive on game day if that holds for week 1, right? And is that Gaziano and Huggins, who are presumably the last 2 guys, or could the Falcons surprise us week 1 and deactivate, Zach Harrison or D'Angelo Malone as one of those inactive players? That's something that we'll have to pay attention to. So we'll see if they make any adjustments to this D-line room. But presumably Ryan Nielsen's fingerprints are all over this. There was a part of me earlier today that was like, it'll be telling if the Falcons keep like 12 D linemen this year, and that will be just basically Ryan Nielsen being able to pull his weight. But they got close to that. They got 11. So we'll see if that changes in the next couple of days. At linebacker, Mike Jones Jr., who Andre Smith and Frank Ginda got cut. No surprises. I thought Jones flashed as a pass rusher, but didn't really do much in run game and pass coverage. And Smith was very good in run support, but not very good in coverage this summer. So not a surprise that none of those guys had this sort of complete skill set to make the roster. I don't know if Tay Davis has the complete skill set to make the roster, but at least he can play special teams. Cornerback, Darren Hall, Breon Borders, and Natron Brooks were cut. Cornell Armstrong is headed to IR. Hall's released set off a little bit of a firestorm on Twitter for people rehashing the Falcons 2021 draft. And my take at the time was that was a pretty middling draft class, and I don't feel like it's aged particularly well, over the last 2 years. Um, I thought Hall had a chance to be an above average slot cornerback in the NFL and would struggle as an outside corner. So, of course, the Falcons decided after his first year to move him to outside corner. And, here we are. So I know some of you guys are very sensitive about the idea that, maybe the Falcons brass don't always utilize their players, every single player on the roster in the best way. But, you read into that however you want. But, I thought Borders and Brooks did good things in the preseason. As I said on an earlier episode, I think earlier over the weekend or whenever it was, Hall didn't really do anything in the preseason. He wasn't bad. He wasn't good. He was just kind of middling. At least Borders and Brooks made plays. I think their limitations got exposed in that Steelers game going up against starters like Deontay Johnson and George Pickens. But between the two, I thought Brooks looked a lot better in that game in particular, and probably outside of the Miami game where Borders was balling. I thought Brooks looked the better of those two, and he would be the guy that I would project to make the practice squad. Armstrong, of course, was hurt all summer long, but we'll see if he's back or the Falcons move on from him with an injury settlement, hoping to potentially get him back later in the season. And for those of you that don't know what an injury settlement is, basically you're not really allowed to cut hurt players, and so you can reach an injury settlement where you pay them a certain amount, and then it's basically to cover their rehab for a certain amount of weeks or something like that. That's basically how it works. It's basically like workman's comp, the NFL version of it. And you can then, after a certain amount of time has passed, you can re-sign those guys. That's basically how it works. So oftentimes you don't see teams cut a guy with an injury settlement and bring them back, but it can happen. So maybe that happens with Armstrong and some of these other guys that are going to be on IR. They already did that with Frank Darby, and we'll see if they do that with Felipe Franks and Ade Ogundeji as well. So wrapping up the safety position, Cliff Chapman, Lucas Dennis, and Micah Abernathy got cut. I thought Abernathy would stick because of his special teams value. Mentioned Dennis on Monday's episode, liking his coverage range. I'll be curious to see if Chapman sticks around. I've been projecting him on my practice squad the last couple of weeks, mostly because he was used almost exclusively as a dime safety in the preseason games, which to me suggests that the Falcons have like some sort of plan for him moving forward, right, with their high usage of dime. So I'll be curious to see who among these safeties winds up being brought back to the practice squad. I'm assuming Abernathy will be that guy, but presumably with Abernathy being cut, assuming that he is not back on the roster come week one, DeMarco Hellams seems to be the likeliest candidate to be the Falcons' personal protector on their punt team. So I'll have to sort of adjust my special teams depth chart that I sort of keep underneath my pillow and stare at every night before I fall asleep, moving forward. So we'll see how that goes. But I didn't get a chance to peruse all the cuts. Just kind of quickly skim through all the cuts to look at the offensive linemen. Chuma Adoga was cut by Dallas, but I saw some reports that he is expected to be one of those procedural cuts that does wind up re-signing with the team so that they can get that freed up roster spot to do whatever they need to do tomorrow, whether that's making a waiver claim, whether that's putting guys on IR, whatever it is. Jerron Christian, Cedric Aboyhe, Dennis Kelly, Jermaine Ifedi were players that we've mentioned before on the podcast as potential swing tackles. All of those guys were cut. Josh Andrews, if you're interested in another familiar name from the recent years, he was also cut by the Eagles. So if you want to run that back, good luck with that. Tristan Colon is another interesting name that got cut because the Falcons tried to pursue him in free agency and he wound up signing with the Jets. He's a center / guard. And so maybe the Falcons, dip back in that well, similar to kind of did with Kamoko Toure recently. Cam Irving's another notable name that was cut by the Panthers, and he's notable just because he has experience, I think, playing all 5 offensive line starting spots. So that's pretty good depth there. Calvin Throckmorton, another guy that has versatility, was cut by the Saints. He's only played guard in the NFL, but in college, I know he did play some center and tackle as well. So that may be another name to keep your eye on, given that Saints connection. In terms of the Chiefs and Packers, who we talked about on yesterday as, maybe teams that might want to unload some depth tackles via trade, based off of what I saw from their initial 53, The Chiefs have 10 guys on their offensive line. The Packers have 11 guys currently. So that may mean that a trade potentially is in the works, because you don't usually see teams carrying 10 or 11 offensive linemen on their roster during the regular season. It happens occasionally, but I know I was listening to Locked On Chiefs in their 53-man projection, and I think they both projected like 8 or 9 offensive linemen for the Chiefs to make it. And we mentioned Prince Tega Winogo as a potential trade option for the Falcons that the Chiefs may want to unload, but the Locked On Chiefs guys mentioned Lucas Niang as a potential trade option. So maybe that's, 2 candidates there. Josh Nyman was the potential trade option for the Packers that I mentioned on yesterday's episode as well. So we'll see what happens. Of course, we'll see how it all plays out. The Falcons should make a move tomorrow. We'll see who they put on the practice squad. We'll see if there's some procedural moves, some guys that go on the short-term IR. Kadero Hodge and Jeff Okudah are the 2 names that I would keep an eye on as far as that goes, going on short-term IR. I'm assuming, given the soft tissue issues with Hughes and Patterson, that they're not going to miss 4 weeks of the season. That's still concern with you. If Hodge and Okudah have those high ankle sprains, they might be out for 4 weeks. And so putting them on the short-term IR means that you get them back for week 5. We saw a similar thing happen with Isaiah Oliver last year. So that will be something to keep an eye on. But that's going to do it for us, guys. Tomorrow we'll be back with that first listen, talking about whatever additional moves the Falcons have made. Continue to make us your first listen. For your second listen, of course, check out Locked On NFL, or if you want to get those scoop on, the Panthers cuts, since we're going to start paying a lot more attention to the Panthers over the next 10 days, check out Locked On Panthers as well as your second listen. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.